Okay, thank you guys for being here. My name is Julie Moose. I'm the executive director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, and it's great to see you guys here. So welcome to how to get people to read what you write and then do what you want, which is probably the more challenging part. I'm really excited to introduce Trish Hall. I was just telling her I've been reading her book, Writing to Persuade. She worked for the New York Times for more than 2 decades, which is an incredible accomplishment, starting out as a food writer and ultimately ascending to the paper's masthead, from which she oversaw the feature sections, and for nearly 5 years was the paper's op-ed editor. She also created the Sunday Review, which has been one of the most popular sections at the time. And her book, Writing to Persuade, was published in June, and it will be available at the book fair later today, and Trish will be there as well. So please join me in welcoming Trish Hall.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I put this down now? Oh no, do you need that? I'll put this here. You make it sound like 20 years is a great accomplishment, maybe. One central point is that and I'll get to that more, but before we get into questions later, and I hope there will be, I am curious who's here. Let me understand what you might. Like, how many writers are there in the room? Okay, a lot of writers. Editors? Fewer. Just people who want to be influential? PR? Okay, great. Okay, great. So it's very evenly divided. That's good. People in PR especially know this, but forever, for decades, the way we persuaded people. Did this just go off? It's back. People using the telephone, and mostly by person. It's always the great gift of salespeople, of really good reporters. Find your way to sort of seduce people on the phone. When I started out as a reporter, that was certainly how you would get through to people. Of course, it's very different. Now, whether you're a writer or whether you see yourself as a writer, everybody writes. You have to write to reach people. And so what used to happen on email, on text, and that's one of my favorite stories. Like, I know there's a lot of good stories, but that's a good one. So on average, and this might be a year-old statistic, but American adults are texting about 30 times a day. So that's twice what we were doing 8 years ago. And so you need to break through the clutter. No matter what you're doing, whether you're writing a story, whether you're a PR person, if you're just trying to break into a place somehow, if you're trying to get someone to do you a favor, you have to get through that. And you have to assume that anyone that you're trying to is, tired, out, has too much instinct to everything is going to be to say no, because they just have so much coming at them, and it didn't used to be that extreme. So in the course of doing research for this book, I started out by looking into all the psychology studies on what makes people change their minds. It might have been a good idea to do that before I became the op-ed editor, but I didn't. Because of the newspaper, I finished the other job I was doing on a Friday, and I started my new job on a Monday, and I had no idea what I was doing, and you learn on the job. So I just dove in, and so it was really interesting after the fact to look at what persuades people. That what I instinctively understood from being an editor for so many years is actually backed up by the psychological research. Not all of it, but a lot of it. That there are these sort of deep psychological truths about all of us, and if you understand them, that will help you get what you want. This is going on and off, yes. Excuse me. deep way is very disturbing, is that we really literally will not listen to things that contradict what we believe. We just, our brains actually just block them out. So, and we're very eagerly take in information that supports what we do believe. So that's really hard for journalists to accept. That was the hardest thing for me about writing this book, because I always love being a reporter and love facts. And you think that the facts that you amass are going to be influential and change people's minds, and it's a little disturbing that they're not. On the other hand, the research also shows that facts do matter, that people get very angry if you mislead them, and if you're going to use an anecdote in your argument, you have to be sure it's true. If you're going to use statistics, they have to be true. I really saw that in op-ed. Some of that's op-ed, just op-ed anywhere, and some of that's being at the New York Times. But we fact-checked everything incredibly carefully. And yes, some people would be outraged at the opinions, but if the facts were wrong, you just got killed. And so they can't be wrong. Even if it's not the primary way you persuade people, they have to be right or you lose your credibility, and people spend all their time in the comments attacking the one little fact you got wrong, and then you're just kind of dead. And even in sort of personal life, relationships that you have with colleagues, with your friends, with people in the industry, if you don't tell the truth, if you just lie in little ways all the time, like I'll be there in 10 minutes, people stop trusting you. It catches up to you. So that is it's just this weird dichotomy with facts. They don't matter, they do matter. What I did know from being an editor for so long, and the research really backed this up, is that stories are what matter. Like facts may have an influence. They've certainly influenced me. They, mostly made me stop smoking. Took a while. But more than that are the stories, that we all respond to stories. Our brains are wired to respond to stories. That's how we sort of take in information. So I think it was around the time when Brexit first started, which is hard to believe there was a beginning. That was a long time ago now. As people studying people's attitudes in Britain toward immigration. And when they gave them sort of facts and statistical information, it just didn't affect people. But when it's interesting the way they do psychological research. They talk about information as a dose, right? But when they gave them a sort of a dose that included a story, like a story about a family or a little kid or something real that people could relate to, it affected the way they looked at information about immigration. And it got through. It got through to them. It may not have changed their minds, but they heard it. So we hear stories. We hear them when they're about humans. We especially like them when they're about ourselves. When I was a feature writer, I wrote a lot of what I liked to call sociology stories, but what they really were, when I was a food writer especially, were stories about ourselves, how we ate, what it meant, what our eating behavior meant, what does it mean when you're walking and eating, what does it mean when you're eating in small bits. And those stories were really popular because in the end, we like to know about ourselves. Whether that seems like a good or a bad thing, it's true. So those are some of the sort of psychological foundations for persuasion, but then there's other tactics that also surprised me a little. I don't really like to ask for things. Some of that is from being a journalist for so long, and you're never supposed to ask for favors or really ask for anything. So one thing I found interesting was how much work has been done on the value of asking. It does seem obvious that if you don't ask, you won't get it, but it goes much deeper than that. Obviously, if you don't ask, there is a chance you won't get it. But people really underestimate they underestimate the brains of the others, that we're wired to say yes and to be helpful, and that people want to say yes. And sometimes they say yes even when they don't want to. And you can take advantage of that fact. And if you look at yourself, you sort of understand that it's true. Like, I just came down here this morning on the train, And I got there early, and I got my perfect seat, and it was sort of on the right-hand side of the train coming out of New York, where there's not a lot of light hitting the computer, and there was no one to my right, and I was incredibly happy. And then this couple came along, and I was like writing, and I just had the sense that they were old, but I didn't really look up, and they were like sort of yelling at me that they wanted to sit together, and couldn't I sit over there? And I'm like, no, I really like this seat. And I just was like trying to ignore them, and they just kept going. We really want to sit together, we want these seats. And I was like, all right. And I just like moved my stuff over, and then I went to get a cup of coffee. And then I thought, why am I so pissed off? Like, what's wrong with me? Like, it's just a seat. And then it reminded me of this study that I read where they're looking at the power of asking, and they did it by having, say, a line for a copier machine. And someone wanted to cut in, and they had someone cut in and say, excuse me, can I get in line? And people obviously weren't happy about that. But if they gave a reason, if they gave any kind of reason, like, I have a meeting at 4, people were much more accommodating. So it was really weird. I realized that if those people had said, you know, we need to work on a project together, or my wife has a heart condition, or almost any reason, instead of sort of making me feel like a little bullied and a little pathetic, because then I started getting into this whole mindset of I was wearing my jeans and a t-shirt with they've asked a man in a suit. You know, I was like going through this whole ridiculous thing about why did they pick on me with my perfect seat? But the fact is I moved. So if they had given me a reason, I would have been happier. But even without a reason, people's instinct is to be cooperative, which it's easy to forget as a journalist because you feel like you're dealing with a lot of uncooperative people. But that is their instinct, and if you really want something, it's worth asking for it, and it's worth figuring out how to sort of craft that request. So when you're thinking about how to craft it, whatever it is, the most important thing is understanding your audience. Your audience might be a person of one, it might be an editor somewhere, or you might be writing a piece and you're actually talking about an audience of readers. In general, we're persuaded by people who make it clear they understand us, that they relate to our concerns, and so you really have to find ways to connect to people. It seems obvious, but it's not actually how the world works. There are often people who try to get what they want by yelling, like the people on the train. But actually, in general, there's plenty of exceptions, but in general, psychologists have found if you're warm and you're friendly and you make it clear you sort of understand where the other person's coming from, you're more likely to get a yes. And that's really about empathy. It's about thinking about where the person's coming from and what they care about and who they really are. And that word is used a lot. And it's used a lot to mean sympathy or connection, and it's not really. What it is that you really just get the other person. So like there are these psychology researchers in Britain, the Allisons, and they did this incredibly interesting research where they got a hold of hundreds of hours of tapes where British interrogators were talking to suspected terrorists or people somehow affiliated with terrorists. And obviously they were trying to get information to thwart further attacks. And they watched what worked and what didn't. And when the people who were interviewing them were really tough, like the whole tough guy image that people have and they often think they should use, they didn't get anywhere. But when they were empathetic, when they said, I just want to understand where you're coming from and what you think and who you are, they would begin to get answers. And I found that amazing because so many of us think that the way to get answers is to be really aggressive, whereas a lot of you might already know some of the very best investigative journalists get answers by not talking and by being so quiet and making people so uncomfortable that they start to talk. I actually went on a date once with a legendary journalist who did that. And I can tell you it works. What? No. But I did talk. So part of being sort of empathetic and figuring out people's minds is knowing their values. And this is another thing I don't think I thought about a lot until I did this book, because you take your own values for granted. You tend to hang out with people who have the same values. I live in Greenwich Village. How many Republicans do you think I know? I'm from a small town. I'm from a Republican family. I certainly have Republican relatives, but they're not running around in my world. That's really a problem, because when you just know people with your own values, it's really hard to speak to the other. So they've done all these studies on, you have to understand the values and then you have to speak from those values. And this applies more like if you're writing op-eds, but I just thought it was really interesting research. Like, let's say you're trying to, they did this study where they had everyone, Republicans, Democrats, not a matter of what your party is, how smart you are, everybody speaks from their own value systems, and then they can't understand why the other person doesn't get it. So they would have, say, a conservative trying to convince a liberal that there should be more spending on the military. And the conservative might talk about values like, you know, national strength and patriotism, and it would just kind of go like this. But if they talked about how valuable the military has been for helping people rise up and get an education and get skills and move out of the class that they were in, then they got much more support. And it might seem obvious, but none of us do it. You just see the same arguments over and over again on issues like abortion especially. I've never, you never see anybody actually making an attempt to understand the values of the other side. It's just like that. So, okay, now getting to the sort of crummy stuff of getting your way. People like to be flattered. There was actually a study by a professor who found there was no limit to the amount of flattery people like. So although I'm sure all of us have had colleagues that we think are disgusting suck-ups, and they flatter way too much, that's what I always thought. I was wrong. It works. I mean, I'm sure that you can go too far, but she didn't actually find you could go too far when she did this research. So flattery helps, understanding people helps, understanding their values helps, and then gifts. So gifts end up being reciprocated in one way or another, sort of directly or not directly. That's why when I was at the Wall Street Journal and then at the New York Times, PR people were always sending gifts, and we always send them back. And if they were flowers and they were just going to die, I would sort of put them in the middle of the room so I wouldn't feel like I was going to be influenced by them, but I do love flowers. And it's not really that they thought people, I mean, they're forbidden not because people would be bought or even the appearance of being bought, but I think that people understand that you unconsciously feel some obligation when people give you something. Like, I've been wandering around a lot talking for this book, and I was in a hotel where I had a really bad room, and I really don't like to complain, but I did, and I got a different room. It was still a little weird. They had a weird, sort of very loud mechanical system, but they were very, very nice. If they hadn't been so nice, I certainly would have gone on TripAdvisor or something and said, don't stay here, there's this really loud mechanical system. But they were nice to me, so I didn't feel like I could. And that's sort of the power of gifts. They don't have to it doesn't have to be a box of candy, but it's like somebody doing something for you or being nice to you or understanding what you need and trying to help you with a problem is very powerful. I always feel stupid with this next one in the time of Trump because he's so argumentative, but the theory is that you should not start arguments, that people don't win arguments, that when you're just sort of battling people, it doesn't go anywhere. I think the reason Trump complicates that so much is because he isn't trying to persuade the people who don't agree with him. He's sort of rousing his people. And the same is true of people on the left. A lot of columnists are sort of argumentative, and they're just getting their people together. So there's a big difference between persuading someone who might not already be on your side and getting your people together. So how do you use these ideas in your work, whatever your work might be? So, okay, don't start arguments with editors if you're trying to get things from them. You know, you probably all know this, but editors, like everyone else, but maybe more so, they're really overworked. They're reading constantly. They're often in a really bad mood. Because of all that, they're probably making a lot of mistakes. I would edit people's copy, an op-ed, and send it back to them, because if you're an outside contributor, you have the final say over your piece, you know, so it's a negotiation. And I'd put in mistakes. I'd do all kinds of stupid things, because everybody does. And the writers I liked the best, not surprisingly, were the ones who said, oh, let me just make this little fix here, and didn't say, you idiot. You know, so it really pays to make life easier for everyone you deal with, even when you just want to kill them. If you can bring yourself to make life easy for people, they will just like you more. And you don't have to feel it. You just have to fake it, because it makes a big difference. So if persuasion in general is about seduction, making someone want to talk to you, figuring out what they want, I guess we should talk about what editors want. In general, book editors, magazine editors, web editors, basically all of us, we want new ideas. People want new ideas. They want to be surprised. As I said, they want to go to as little trouble as possible to do their work. So think about what they want, and that applies to an individual editor as well as to a general audience. People want to say yes. They want to be nice to you. So let's take it starting at the small thing. Let's say you want to get someone to introduce you to someone that you know they know, and you think that person could help you. How do you do that? If somebody asks me to do that, I don't want to say no. Although I don't really know anyone, because I sat in an office for so many years. But let's say I did. I don't want to say no, but I don't want to impose on other people either. So the secret with things like that, if you sort of look at what psychologists have found, is you have to make it clear how that person will benefit from meeting you. You don't want to be thinking about what you need, because it's not about you. It's always got to be about the other person. You have to make it clear how this person would benefit from you, not, I've always wanted to meet so-and-so. So when you're trying to be persuasive, it's always about thinking about what the other person needs, not ever about what you need. So the other thing, having been on the end of about 1,000 op-ed submissions a week and email that went from 6 in the morning till midnight, and I never finished, and I don't even think that's atypical anymore. You have to write really short sentences, and you have to write short emails, and people are so often reading things on their screen. Somebody I worked with in op-ed, people constantly mocked him for reading his emails at the urinal. But you know what? There wasn't really time to read them all. And if you were trying to be a responsible person, you were always reading. And that means not fitting on a computer screen, that means fitting on a phone screen. Now, not everything can fit on one screen, but if you're talking about emails in particular, use your subject line to be really specific. If it's urgent, say it's urgent. If you have a story idea, give me a hint about what the story idea is. One of the Sunday covers that I ran once that I loved was about a guy who described himself when he was on Wall Street as having been addicted to money. He did not wait until the third paragraph to tell me that. He put it in the subject line, because it's really, really easy to miss stuff. And you know, people will always, well, now it's helpful because Gmail has that little thing. If you haven't answered something in 3 days, you get a little reminder. But it's really easy. If you don't answer something in the minute you get it, you completely forget about it. So, but if there's something in the subject line that makes you want to open the email, it makes a big difference. So whatever you're doing, think about who you're sending it to and what's going to make them open it. So make it short. Come right to the point about what you want. If you're pitching a story, have an interesting story idea and have it be surprising and say right away what's surprising. Don't sort of start off with some other stuff. Get right to it, because otherwise it might never be read. So if the sentences are clear and they're short and somebody doesn't have to scroll way down on a phone, then this is really actually something I learned from talking to people about who try to raise money. Your final sentence, am I coming toward the end?
Almost time for questions.
Oh, okay.
Not very subtle cues.
Very persuasive.
Very. You want to end with something that requires the person to answer, because too many emails are not only too long, but they just kind of end. And then you're like, well, do I have to answer this? Do I have to say something? Make it very clear what you want. If it's like, I will leave a ticket at the box office for you, or I will expect to see, or can I meet you for coffee next Tuesday? Even if you're going to get a no, require some kind of action, because otherwise it's way too easy for it to be read and then just kind of fall into the pile. You probably know a lot of this already, but don't use jargon. Don't ever use words like maximize and cost effective and strategies, and don't use those words. Don't like unique. You knew that was planted. Monetize, optimize, paradigm, initiative, it just like goes on. And especially editors and people who are reading all day, that language just becomes like a thing, like a clump, and they don't read it. So you want to be surprising, you want to be timely, you want to go beyond the news, you want to avoid the obvious. And finally, when you're pitching things, you have to know, this gets back to know your audience, who you're pitching, what they've run, what they haven't run, because if they just ran it a week before, you're going to look not so with it. So you don't want to do that. It requires reading a lot before you do anything, which is hard. So I don't know if this is of interest to anyone, but another thing that I did a lot at the Times was I did a lot of hiring. I interviewed a lot of job candidates because I was in the newsroom for a long time running all the feature sections, and then I was in op-ed. And well, sometimes I was firing. We went through periods where we were shrinking, and we went through periods where we were growing. But you know, people would write thank you notes or do job interviews that made them seem like robots or like boilerplate people. I think that's like it's especially a problem with someone like me. Somebody else might not care. At one point I was just like, there's way too many Ivy League people here, and we were interviewing these people, and I'm like, the Harvard guy, the Yale guy, the Princeton guy, they all look alike. I was just like, I mean, it wasn't their fault. It was just sort of like there was a way that they all just seemed like the same person. So you don't want to seem, it's fine to let out who you are, because it really helps. It helps people remember you. So I remember getting an email after an interview with someone that was something like, you know, thank you very much for taking the time to talk, and I know I can contribute a great deal to your organization, and I've developed many skills over the years. It's like, well. It just doesn't really feel like the person. Whereas if they say, you know, I really noticed when I got home that the Instagram stories that you're doing could be better. I know you're doing your best, but what if you did X, Y, and Z? So like specifics and things that make you remember that person always make the difference. So whether you're talking about a small audience, a big audience, one editor, a publication, those are sort of some of my ideas, but I guess I'm running out of time and you have the microphone. And I would love to have lots of questions, because you all come from different backgrounds, and I'm sure you need to know different things.
Hi, my name's Twanda. Is this on? Okay. I wanted to know, when you're deciding which op-eds to actually publish, and you're looking at the author, are you looking at the author who is a cabinet person and very important, as opposed to, you know, Joe Smith, Because I've been told that sometimes it seems like if you have the name, then you can get in. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. A lot of op-eds were people like that, cabinet people who had some kind of power, saying uninteresting things or unsurprising. It wasn't their fault. It wasn't their fault, but what can they say, really, right? Those aren't really the source, those aren't usually the source of really radical ideas. One of the editors in op-ed, I went there knowing nothing about op-ed, so did a lot of the other editors. We'd been in the newsroom forever, and this woman had been an editor there forever. She was listening to us argue about something, and she stands up and goes, "You either need a surprising person or a surprising idea." I think she just was so sick of like having to train different people coming through. But I think that that's a really important thing. And if it's a cabinet member affirming something the administration is doing, it's not surprising. If it's a cabinet member attacking her own administration, it is surprising. So it's all about that. On balance, it is great to have people who are well known. When I was there, we had the op-eds from Angelina Jolie. Of course, you want well-known people because people are going to be inclined to read them. But if they're going to say something really obvious and not interesting, then, I mean, we rejected many of those people because, you know, they have PR operations and they don't really need access to op-ed. I mean, it's a problem because you want a mix of sort of the famous and the person you've never heard of.
Can you talk a little bit about the tension between surprising and confirmation bias? Won't the really surprising idea support nobody's confirmation bias?
That's a good point. It's hard. It's like, because the concept of op-ed, at least at the Times, and I think a lot of places, is that or places that have their own editorials. We had editorials, and they took a kind of liberal, centrist kind of liberal viewpoint. So what I did, and I think what most op-ed editors tried to do, was get people more to the left or more to the right. So I was always trying to find, it's not that hard to find people to the left who will submit to the Times. It was harder to find conservatives because their instinct was to go to the Journal. And Arthur Brooks, who was head of the AEI, who actually gave me the idea for the book, and he's a great writer and he's wonderful. When I first met him, it was fun talking to him. He seemed really interesting. He's a conservative. He's a big free market capitalist. So we needed someone like that, sort of counterweight to Krugman. And he knew how, I think he knew how to reach the audience. He thought a lot about the audience at the Times. And he would sometimes sort of start out with kind of like shared values. He would just sort of try to get past what he knew was that bias. And it takes some skill, but it's like finding where you agree and then digging in further. But it's not easy. I think he was unusual in being able to do it. I mean, most conservatives who write for the Times just completely outrage the Times audience. It's sort of hysterical. I enjoy it. Yes?
Hi, thank you for a really informative talk. I have a question about ongoing issues. I'm a former journalist. I now have my own communications firm, so it's very interesting understanding all sides. And so I wonder about issues that aren't surprising, like there is poverty in the world, there are problems in education. And so as you are crafting persuasive emails and trying to find something surprising, the issue is ongoing. And what journalists hate, it's like, well, tell me what's new about it. No, it's not new. Children are still poor, or kids still can't read, you know? So, specifically around pitching op-eds, how do you either present something as new, or how can we think about something that's ongoing in a new way and then persuade?
I mean, it's a great question. It's the hardest thing to do. It's hard for reporters, as you know, because it's the same thing. You pitch some story and children are still poor. So it's hard no matter what. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because I forgot to mention this op-ed that ran recently. It ran in October, and it's by a Pakistani novelist. And the headline, the reason I read it, the headline was "The Man Who Feeds Ants." It's actually a story about class and poverty in Karachi, but he starts out, he meets a man on the beach who was feeding ants, and he starts talking to him, and then he moves from there into kind of the filth in the city and the divide between rich and poor, and how the poor are suffering from it. They didn't create it, yet somehow they become the victims of it. So it's a lot of issues that are ongoing in every country, but because he's such a good, unfortunately we can't all be like famous Pakistani novelists, but he found a way to tell a story that made it vivid. And I mean, a lot of the books that are bestsellers that we all like to read, they're about things that have been issues for a long time. So it's always, I think, about story, about finding some story that doesn't feel like you've heard it a lot, but it's really hard. Because I just remember rejecting dozens of those because it'd be like, well, of course this is important, but you know, yeah.
Hello, good morning. There's a couple of things I'd like to say. First of all, thank you so much for this talk. I'm actually former BBC radio and TV, and I'm in the process of relocating to the States, which is why I'm here today to see how you guys do things. And I'm very interested to know how I persuade people to actually see me, because in the past I'd be on the phone and I'd use my charm, of course, and whatever. And now I have to write like everybody else. And
I know, I love the phone. It's a
yeah,
great loss.
it's
You
a
could
great
be
pity
you could be in your
that we can no longer
pajamas.
ring people up. Anyway, so but the point I would like to just maybe open up as a discussion as well is about the whole thing about narratives, because obviously Brexit, in my opinion, was won and lost on a very
Right.
strong narrative. It was based on lies. You know, the whole thing that Boris Johnson said
But
about...
it was still a story, and it was a story
but it was
that
a
worked.
very, very strong
Yeah.
story. You know, vote for us because we'll keep the migrants out. They're taking your jobs. And the other narrative to Remain was, you know, if you don't vote for us, we'll all be poor and go to
Right.
hell in a handcart. And, you know, the one that had a more human interest won the day, sadly. So so I think your point about narratives is very strong. But what I would like to ask you about really is, do you think we as writers and broadcasters and communicators have a responsibility to our reading, listening, watching audience to somehow tell the story of Trump differently, to tell the story of Brexit differently? Because people I meet and talk to, they're very tired.
Yeah.
And especially in the UK and probably in the US as well, people are so worn out by the daily Twitter feeds and the Brexit, you know, mess that they're almost saying, well, let's just get out of Brexit. Let's just leave Europe because we're so fed up.
Get it over with, right.
And do you think there comes a point when we have to, as journalists, break the news agenda and do something totally different?
Well, I
are
wish
we also
more people
scared
would. I
to
wish
keep
there-
as
I
a
wish
group,
there-
as a
yeah.
troop? So that's a
I'm
very
sorry,
long...
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
That's
no.
one of my other rules. Don't interrupt. I just did.
So I suppose my question to you is it time for us as communicators and writers and broadcasters to be braver in the way we tell our stories and not necessarily go with the pack and try and get our audience back? Because whilst we don't do that, your current president is undermining everything that everyone does in this room.
I mean, it's complicated because people continue to write stories about other things, but they also really want to read about Trump. I don't know about other newspapers, but the Times has gotten, I mean, Trump has been so good for the Times, it's really depressing. You know, hundreds of thousands of subscribers that we didn't have before. I say we because I don't work there anymore, but I still have stock. So I think people do try to break away from it, and I think it's important to try to do the stories that you believe in, and the stories that you believe are important. But I also think it's tough, and it takes up so much of the air and so much of the space. And you could argue that we should stop paying attention to every little tweet and every little comment, but it is the form that presidential communication is taking at this moment. So I think that people are interested in other stories. They will read other stories, but they have to be good.
It's a bit like the sky's falling, and what else can we talk about?
Yeah, they might be more open to other stories now because they are so tired of Trump. Did somebody back there? Oh, I'm
Just to change text for a sec, given your background. How does what you're talking about in terms of persuading apply to food writing?
Well, did you read Pete Wells's review this week? It was great. Taking down a famous restaurant. As a food reporter, and I was a food reporter for a long time, I wasn't a critic, and I wasn't trying to persuade anyone of anything. Most of the time, I was just trying to be entertaining and informative and really understand the people, the changes, the sort of trends in the food world. I was like, it's a terrible term, but I was like a trend reporter a lot of the time. When you're talking about persuasion in food, maybe you mean how to persuade people to eat better about their diets. Like, is that what you mean? Because just as a reporter, it wasn't about persuasion. It was more about informing. I mean, I do think a lot about, I'm obsessed with food still and all aspects of food and how you persuade people to eat better so they'll live better. It's a lot like the whole cigarette thing, and a lot of that kind of persuasion, I think, works on cultural change, which works on what your group does, which, people stop smoking when their friends stopped smoking and when they started disallowing it in public buildings. So, 30 years ago, half the people in here would have been smoking because it would have been legal. So it's sort of the same with food. I mean, you have to have sort of institutional change to get individual change. But I didn't try to change people's eating habits. I just sort of loved documenting them because they're fascinating to me. Yes?
Well,
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I want to go back to op-eds for a minute. I'm a PR guy, and I've been at it for a while. And when I was, and in my dealings with the Times, every now and then, or more often than every now and then, there would be pushback saying, hey, where did you get this fact from, or do you want to phrase this differently?
Wait, you would say that? Wait.
No, your staff would ask
Oh,
questions
about an op-ed that
things
was
in the
being
op-ed,
edited, right.
which I found perfectly fine. But lately, I've had some experiences where, and this is not the New York Times, but other papers, where they have either cut out parts of the op-ed and that really changed the meaning altogether without sending it back to us, or where it's become almost like a negotiation where the op-ed editor has really tried to almost rewrite the op-ed by saying, well, I'm okay with 90% of it, but I would like you to talk about this too, when the principle that I'm submitting it for, he doesn't agree with that, that's not his agenda. And there's this almost funny imbalance of power. I mean, you want to get the op-ed in there, but really that would be changing the meaning. And so I'm just curious. I mean, what are the standards?
It's funny because I heard that from someone else recently who is an academic actually, and said she's finding increasingly that op-ed editors will call her and say, we want someone to say this. And I thought, wow, that's not what's typical, or it wasn't typical in my experience. I think there might be a change. The balance of power is interesting because in a newsroom with reporters and editors, in a way the editors have the power and the reporters are being paid to work and the editors have the final say, but it's kind of 50-50. But for different reasons. And I think with op-ed, it was always like that too. Like somebody could pull their op-ed. Lots of op-eds were pulled when I was there. If we would edit them and ask questions that someone didn't like, they would just pull it, and that's fine. That's their prerogative. I think it's surprising that someone would be asking a writer to say a certain thing or have a certain opinion. It would make more sense to me if they were asking them to go deeper in some part of it so it would be more persuasive. But really your job as an op-ed editor, I mean, I ran lots of things I didn't agree with or lots of things I had never even thought of before. Your job is to make that person's piece as clear and as strong as possible. So anything that's not doing that is kind of surprising to me. I don't really know why that would be happening, but I guess you have to pull the op-ed at that point. I don't know what you do. Because you
in
can't
the-
say something you don't believe.
The case where, the case where where it was like a negotiation, I was handling the Oakland teachers strike. And before the strike happened, I went to the San Francisco Chronicle and said, would you like to have the president of the teachers union in Oakland? And there was like an issue like related taxes in Sacramento. Well, he should comment about that. No, he wanted to talk
Right.
about the issues that were going on in Oakland. And so in that case, I stuck to my guns because I thought that ultimately they would like to have
Right.
that side of the story in the paper, and we won. But I have a feeling often I would not. The other was the Houston Chronicle, where they sent it back to me. They print. I didn't even know they printed it until somebody said, "Hey, I just saw this in the
Yeah, I
paper."
find that
and
sort
they
of
cut
scary,
out about a
but-
third of the op-ed, and there it was from somebody from another state talking about something happening in Texas, and they cut out everything about the state he was from. It completely changed the whole context of the piece.
I mean, it seems wrong to me, but it's also understandable. I think newspapers are under so much pressure and their staffs have been cut so much. That's probably the explanation, not a good one, but a real one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just got a quick question. I'm a reporter in the room, so I should have raised my hand when I said a writer, but I'm just like that hardcore. Can you explain
It's
kind
the
of
best thing to be. It's the most fun.
Thanks. So can you explain kind of how your research and persuasion might help a reporter when it comes to persuading an editor about a story? And I'm specifically thinking, what if you over persuade your editor and then can't get them off the idea because the story's changed? Because it was so persuasive.
Yeah.
Like, is this experience demonstrative of something larger your work has informed you about that can help us better do our jobs?
I think that's really hard because when you have a story idea and the editor says, yes, I love it, and then you report it and it doesn't match that, they're going to start pushing you to go back to that. All the time they're going to do that because they loved that idea. So then you're in this crazy position where you have to prove to them that that's not a story and then prove that the other one is. It was interesting. At the Wall Street Journal, there was sort of more reporting before the fact. Like, we would do a lot of reporting on stories before we pitched them because there were all those long page one leaders. They're slightly different now. And so you knew that you really had it before you pitched it. And I think people don't always have time to do that, but that's the way to protect yourself from that, to know that you've got the story. Because, yeah, otherwise you're just stuck trying to prove that your old idea doesn't work. I mean, people are just human, and they love that idea. They want it.
To the point where you might just drop it.
Yeah. I mean, if it's not true, I mean, the worst thing is when an editor has a story that the editor won't drop. The only story I've ever been ashamed of is one I wrote that an editor made me do, and it was nothing. There was no story. But, you know, it's hard to change people's convictions that they're right. 2 minutes, so we have time for one more question.
I have a quick one. It's a timing question. Thank you. It's a timing question. In terms of op-eds, I'm just going to pick an arbitrary date. It's Valentine's Day. How soon do I have to get my procrastinating writer to get the op-ed in? And my other question is, with letters to the editor, how soon after this article do I have to submit it?
There's like, right, two separate questions. So I'll start with the letters. And the everything's speeded up so much, it's insane. People want to have op-eds off the news within 2 or 3 hours, which, I mean, I think it's nuts, but that's sort of where it's gone. And the same is true with letters. You know, people are emailing them, obviously not sending them anymore. And the expectation for letters that they're on the news is like before the end of that day. I mean, if you want to get published. I mean, I didn't edit letters. I only knew the letters people. On the evergreen things, or going back to the question about things that are always in the news but that we never solve, like poverty, if it's tied to a date, an anniversary, a holiday like Valentine's Day, it's good to have a peg. Like, people say they hate those fake pegs, but they actually do have to fill their space, and so they do like them to some extent. And you don't want to do it so early that they're like, Valentine's, it's only August, why am I getting Valentine's Day? But don't wait until like 2 weeks before, because by 2 weeks before, they'll probably have had like 5 submissions for Mother's Day or Valentine's Day. So if it's like a month before and then start nagging in a couple days, it gives you it builds in nagging time.
Well, on that
Thank
nagging
you.
note, thank you so much, Trish. And
thank
please,
you.
everybody join me in thanking
Thank
Trish.
you.
And just a reminder, if you have more questions or just want to chat a
Oh,
little
I
bit
wanted
more.
to tell you that, yes. Oh, well, I'm still here. If anybody wants to contact me, I will be at the book fair later, but also my email is trishphall@gmail. You cannot forget the P, otherwise you will go to a real estate broker in Nevada.
Thank
Oh.
you again. And your next session is going to be starting in 5 minutes.